Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We are in Antony. In saying this, they saluted them and embraced them with a greater show of friendship. This made the Romans full of confidence again, and Antony, on hearing of it, was more disposed to take the road through level country, being told that no water was to be hoped for on that through the mountains. But while he was preparing thus to do, Mithridates came into the camp, a cousin to Manassas, of whom we related that he sought refuge with the Romans and received in gift from Antony 3 cities. Upon his arrival, he desired somebody might be brought to him that could speak Syriac or Parthian. One Alexander of Antioch, a friend of Antony's, was brought to him, to whom the stranger, giving his name and mentioning Manassas as the person who desired to do the kindness, put the question, did he see that high range of hills pointing at some distance? He told him, yes, it is there. Said he, the whole Parthian army lie in wait for your passage, for the great plains come immediately up to them, and they expect that, confiding in their promises, you will leave the way of the mountains and take the level route. It is true that in passing over the mountains you will suffer the want of water and the fatigue to which you have become familiar. But if you pass through the plains, Antony must expect the fortune of Crassus. This said, he departed, Antony in alarm, calling his friends in council, sent for the Mardian guide, who was of the same opinion. He told them that, with or without enemies, the want of any certain track in the plain, and the likelihood of their losing their way, were quite objection enough. The other route was rough and without water, but then it was but for a day. Antony, therefore, changing his mind, marched away upon this road that night, commanding that every one should carry water sufficient for his own use. But most of them being unprovided with vessels, they made shift with their helmets, and some with skins. As soon as they started, the news of it was carried to the Parthians, who followed them, contrary to their custom, through the night, and at sunrise attacked the rear, which was tired with marching and want of sleep, and not in condition to make any considerable defense, for they had got through 240 furlongs that night. And at the end of such a march, to find the enemy in great haste, in depth of winter, through continual storms of snow, he lost 8,000 of his men, and came with much diminished numbers to a place called the White Village, between Sidon and Berytus, on the sea coast, where he waited for the arrival of Cleopatra, and, being impatient of the delay she made, he bethought himself shortening the time in wine and drunkenness, and yet could not endure the tediousness of a meal, but would start from the table and run to see if she were coming, till at last she came into port, and brought with her clothes and money for the soldiers, though some say that Antony only received the clothes from her and distributed his own money in her name. So previously to this, the Parthians, finding they could not divide the Roman army nor break the order of their battle, and that withal they had been so often worsted, once more began to treat the foragers with professions of humanity. They came up to them with their bows unbent, telling them that they were going home to their houses, that this was the end of their retaliation, and that only some Median troops would follow for 2 or 3 days, not with any design to annoy them, but for the defense of some of the villages further on. A quarrel presently happened between the king of Media and Phraates of Parthia, beginning, it is said, about the division of the booty, the war spoils, that was taken from the Romans, and creating great apprehension in the Median, lest he should lose his kingdom. He sent, therefore, ambassadors to Antony, with offers of entering into a confederate war against Phraates and Antony, full of hopes at being thus asked as a favor to accept that one thing, horse and archers, the want of which had hindered his beating the Parthians before, began at once to prepare for a return to Armenia, there to join the Medes on the Araxes, and begin the war afresh. But Octavia in Rome, being desirous to see Antony, asked Caesar's leave to go to him, which he gave her, not so much, say most authors, to gratify his sister, as to obtain a fair pretence to begin the war upon her dishonorable reception. She no sooner arrived at Athens, but by letters from Antony she was informed of his new expedition, and his will that she should await him there. And though she were much displeased, not being ignorant of the real reason of this usage, yet she wrote to him to know what place he would be pleased she should send the things she had brought with her for his use. For she had brought clothes for his soldiers, baggage, cattle, money, and presents for his friends and officers, and 2,000 chosen soldiers, sumptuously armed, to form praetorian cohorts. This message was brought from Octavia to Antony by Niger. You don't say the G as a J. One of his friends, who added to it the praises she deserves so well. Well, there were people named. Doesn't Luke relate to the word for white? So people did have names like that. It wasn't anything that people made a big deal about back then. Cleopatra, feeling her rival already, as it were, at hand, was seized with fear lest if, to her noble life and her high alliance, and we don't even know if, when you have names like this, that it's, that there was actual racial difference between the two or something. Lest if it, to her noble life and her high alliance, she once could add the charm of daily habit and affection intercourse, she should become irresistible and be his absolute mistress forever. So she feigned to be dying for love of Antony, bringing her body down by slender diet. When he entered the room, she fixed her eyes upon him in a rapture, and when he left, seemed to languish and half faint away. She took great pains that he should see her in tears, and as soon as he noticed it, hastily dried them up, and turned away as if it were her wish that he should know nothing of it. All this was acting while he prepared for Medium, and Cleopatra's creatures were not slow to forward the design, upbraiding Antony with his unfeeling, hard-hearted temper, and thus letting a woman perish whose soul depended upon him, and him alone. And I'm sure that sort of emotional blackmail was used since time immemorial and is continually used, but some people don't go to those means. You be honest, and even if you do have emotional problems, don't blame it on you can't leave me alone because well, that you have to be emotionally dependent upon yourself, really. Octavia it was true, was his wife, and he had been married. Oh, Octavia, it is true, was his wife, and had been married to him, because it was found convenient for the affairs of her brother that it should be so, and she had the honor of the title. But Cleopatra, sovereign queen of many nations, had been contented with the name of his mistress, nor did she shun or despise the character, whilst she might see him, might live with him, and enjoy him. If she were bereaved of this, she would not survive the loss. In fine, they so melted and unmanned him that, fully believing she would die if he forsook her, he put off the war and returned to Alexandria, deferring his Median expedition until next summer, though news came of the Parthians being all in confusion with intestine disputes. Nevertheless, he did some time after go into that country, and made an alliance with the king of Media, by marriage of a son of his by Cleopatra to the king's daughter, who was yet very young, and so returned, with his thoughts taken up about the civil war. When Octavia returned from Athens, Caesar, who considered she had been injuriously treated, commanded her to live in a separate house, but she refused to leave the house of her husband, and entreated him, unless he had already resolved upon other motives to make war with Antony, that he would on her account let it alone. It would be intolerable to have it said of the two greatest commanders in the world that they had involved the Roman people in a civil war, the one out of passion for, the other out of resentment about a woman. Well, should it be about any mere passion or resentment? And her behavior proved her words to be sincere. She remained in Antony's house as if he were at home in it, and took the noblest and most generous care, not only of his children by her, but of those by Fulvia too. She received all the friends of Antony that came to Rome to seek office or upon any business, and did her utmost to prefer the request to Caesar. Yet this her honorable deportment did but, without her meaning it, damage the reputation of Antony. The wrong he did to such a woman made him halted, nor was the division he made among his sons at Alexandria less unpopular. It seemed a theatrical piece of insolence and contempt of his country, for assembling the people in the exercise ground and causing two golden thrones to be placed on a platform of silver, the one for him and the other for Cleopatra, and at their feet lower thrones for their children, he proclaimed Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Coeda Saria, and with her conjointly Caesarion, the reputed son of the former Caesar, who left Cleopatra with child. His own sons by Cleopatra were to have the style of the King of Kings. To Alexander he gave Armenia and Media, with Parthia, so soon as it should be overcome, to Ptolemy, Phoenicia, Saria, and Cilicia. Alexander was brought out before the people in Median costume, the tiara and upright peak, Ptolemy and boots and mantle, a Macedonian cap, done about with the diadem, for this was the habit of the successors of Alexander, as the other was of the Medes and Armenians. And as soon as they had saluted their parents, the one was received by a guard of Macedonians, the other by one of Armenians. Cleopatra was then, as at other times, when she appeared in public, dressed in the habit of Isis, and gave audience to the people under the name of New Isis. New Ast, the weaver and the pregnant and enthroned one. I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but Nuit as a new Nuit Hadit Rahal Kuit. That Trinity, you could say. Not Ra. You could with the Caesar relating these things in the Senate, and often complaining to the people, excited men's minds against Antony. Antony also sent messengers of accusation against Caesar. The principal of his charges were these: first, that he had not made any division with him of Sicula, which was lately taken from Pompey. Secondly, that he had retained the ships he had lent him for the war. Thirdly, that after deposing Lepidus, the colleague he had taken for himself, the army, governance, and revenues formerly appropriated to him. And lastly, that he had parceled out almost all Italy amongst his own soldiers, and left nothing for his. Caesar's answer was as follows: that he had put Lepidus out of government because of his own misconduct, and that what he had got in war he would divide with Antony. So as soon as Antony gave him a share of Armenia, that Antony's soldiers had no claims in Italy, being in possession of Media and Parthia, the acquisitions which their brave actions under their general had added to the Roman Empire. Antony was in Armenia when this answer came to him, and immediately sent Canidius with 16 legions towards the sea. But he, in the company of Cleopatra, went to Ephesus, whither ships were coming in from all quarters to form the navy, consisting vessels of burden included of 800 vessels, of which Cleopatra furnished 200, together with 20,000 talents and provision for the whole army during the war. Antony, on the advice of Domitius and some others, bade Cleopatra return into Egypt, there to expect the event of the war, but she, dreading some new reconciliation by Octavia's means, prevailed with Canidius by a large sum of money to speak in her favor with Antony, pointing out to him that it was not just that one that bore so great a part in the charge of the war should be robbed of her share of glory in the carrying it on, nor would it be politic to disoblige the Egyptians, who were so considerable a part of his naval forces, nor did he see how she was inferior in prudence to any of the kings that were serving with him. She had long governed a great kingdom by herself alone, and had long lived with him, and gained experience in public affairs. These arguments, so the fate that destined all to Caesar would have it, prevailed, and when all their forces had met, they sailed together to Samos, and held high festivities. Were they the seasonal ones? Well, I mean, virtually all the ones are seasonal ones, right? Because no matter what day they have it, it's always going to be related to that, right? For, as it was ordered that all kings, princes, and governors, all nations and cities within the limits of Syria, the Ma'atid Lake, Armenia, and Ilaria, should bring or cause to be brought all munitions necessary for war, so was it also proclaimed that all stage players should make their appearance at Samos, so that, while pretty nearly the whole world was filled with groans and lamentations, this one island for some days resounded with piping and harping, theatres filling, choruses playing. Every city sent an ox as its contribution to the sacrifice, and the kings that accompanied Antony competed who should make the most magnificent feasts and the greatest presents, and men began to ask themselves what would be done to celebrate that victory. when that they went to such an expense of festivity at the opening of the war. This over, he gave Priena to his players for habitation, and set sail for Athens, where fresh sports and play acting employed him. Cleopatra, jealous of the honors of Octavia, had received at Athens, for Octavia was much beloved by the Athenians, courted the favor of the people with all sorts of attentions. The Athenians, in requital, having decreed her public honors, deputed several of the citizens to wait upon her at her house, amongst whom went Antony as one, he being an Athenian citizen. And he it was that made the speech. He sent orders to Rome to have Octavia removed out of his house. She left it, we are told, accompanied by all his children, except the eldest by Fulvia, who was then with his father, weeping and grieving that she must be looked upon as one of the causes of the war. But the Romans pitied not so much her as Antony himself, and more particularly those who had seen Cleopatra, whom they could report to have no way the advantage of Octavia either in youth or in beauty. Well, we should see that there's something beyond that, but that's part of why there's so much complaint about age differences nowadays, that these people don't think this body beautiful and all this other stuff, they don't think they have anything else to offer except a youthful, beautiful body. Of course, people can maintain themselves to a certain degree, but you know what I mean. And look at the guy who was in charge of it, who promoted the movement, basically, that billionaire. The speed and extent of Antony's preparations alarmed Caesar, who feared he might be forced to fight the decisive battle that summer, for he wanted many necessaries, and the people grudged very much to pay the taxes. Freemen being called upon to pay a fourth part of their incomes, and freed slaves an eighth of their property, so that there were loud outcries against him, and disturbances throughout all Italy, and this is looked upon as one of the greatest of Antony's oversights, that he did not then press the war, for he allowed time at once for Caesar to make his preparations, and for commotions to pass over. For while people were having their money called for, they were mutinous and violent, but having paid it, they held their peace. Titius and Plancus, men of consular dignity and friends to Antony, having been ill-used by Cleopatra, whom they had most resisted in her design of being present in the war, came over to Caesar and gave information of the contents of Antony's will, with which they were acquainted. It was deposited in the hands of the Vestal virgins, who refused to deliver it up, and sent Caesar word, if he pleased, he should come and seize it himself, which he did, and reading it over to himself, he noted those places that were most for his purpose, and having summoned the Senate, read them publicly. Many were scandalized at the proceeding, thinking it out of reason and equity to call a man to account for what was not to be, unless after his death Caesar specially pressed what Antony said in his will about his burial, where he carried in state through the forum, should be sent to Cleopatra at Alexandria. Calvisius, a dependent of Caesar's, urged other charges in connection with Cleopatra against Antony, that he had given her the library of Pergamus, containing 200,000 distinct volumes, that at a great banquet, in the presence of many guests, he had risen up and rubbed her feet to fulfill some wager or promise, that he had suffered the Ephesians to salute her as their queen, that he had frequently at the public audience of kings and princes, received amorous messages written in tablets made of onyx and crystal, and read them openly on the tribunal. That when Furnius, a man of great authority and eloquence among the Romans, was pleading, Cleopatra kept happening to pass by in her chair, Antony started up and left them in the middle of their cause to follow at her side and attend her home. Calvisius, however, was looked upon as the inventor of most of these stories. Antony's friends went up and down the city to gain him credit, and sent one of themselves, Geminius, to him, to beg him and take heed and not allow himself to be deprived by vote of his authority, and proclaimed a public enemy to the Roman state. But Geminius no sooner arrived in Greece, but he was looked upon as one of Octavia's spies. At their suppers he was made a continual butt for mockery, and was put to sit in the least honorable places, all of which he bore very well, seeking only an occasion of speaking with Antony. So at supper, being told to say what business he came about, he answered he would keep the rest for a soberer hour, but one thing he had to say, whether full or fasting, that all would go well if Cleopatra would return to Egypt. Now, whether you're full or fasting, it's not about doing or not doing, it's about your consciousness and principle in it, right? And on Antony showing his anger at it, you have done well, Geminius, said Cleopatra, to tell your secret without being put to the rack. So Geminius, after a few days, took occasion to make his escape and go to Rome. Many more of Antony's friends were driven from him by the insolent usage they had from Cleopatra's flatterers, amongst whom were Marcus Silanus and Dellius. The historian Delius says he was afraid of his life, and that Glaucus, the physician, informed him that Cleopatra's design against him of Cleopatra's design against him. She was angry with him for having said that Antony's friends were served with sour wine, while at Rome, Sarmentus, Caesar's little page, this delicia, as the Romans call it, drank Falernian, yeah, I don't know wine, so whatever. As soon as Caesar had completed his preparations, he had a decree made declaring war on Cleopatra and depriving Antony of the authority which he had let a woman exercise in his place. Caesar added that he had drunk potions that had bereaved him of his senses. Well, some people do that. And that the generals they would have to fight with would be Mardian the eunuch, Pothinus, Eras, Cleopatra's hairdressing girl, and Carmion, who were Antony's chief state counselors. These prodigies are said to have announced the war. Pisarum, where Antony had settled a colony on the Adriatic Sea, was swallowed up by an earthquake. Sweat ran from one of the marble statues of Antony at Alba for many days together, and although frequently wiped off, did not stop. When he himself was in the city of Petra, the temple of Hercules was struck by lightning, and at Athens the figure of Bacchus was torn by a violent wind out of the battle of giants, and laid flat upon the theatre, with both which entities Antony claimed connection, professing it to be descended from Hercules. Well, we know Hercules was a divine, divinized individual. Bacchus and bunch of other ones could have been too. Imitating Bacchus in the way of living and having received the name of Bacchus. The same whirlwind at Athens also brought down from amongst many others which were not disturbed the colossal statues of Phamenus and Attalus, which were inscribed with Antony's name, and in Cleopatra's admiral galley, which was called Antonius, a most inauspicious omen occurred. Some swallows had built in the stern of the galley, but other swallows came, beat the first away, and destroyed their nests. That could be a positive omen, depending on how you take that, right? When armaments gathered for the war, Antony had no less than 500 ships of war, including numerous galleys of 8 and 10 banks of oars, as richly ornamented as if they were meant for a triumph. Now, I'm not saying that everything that's mentioned as some sort of male or female deity or it has some sort of objective reality behind it, except for say that there's categories or something in the physical world or psychological world that these things correspond to. But if there wasn't really some incarnated entity, still could be some spiritual being that's encouraging the whole thing, that likes to go by the name. He had 100,000 foot and 12,000 horse. He had vassal kings attending: Bacchus of Libya, Tarchondemus of the Upper Cilicia, Archelaus of Cappadocia, Philadelphus of Paphlagonia, Mithridates of Commagena, and Sadalus of Thraca. All these were with him in person. Out of Pontus Paulman he sent him considerable forces, as did also Malchus from Arabia, Herod the Jew, and Amantas, the king of Laconia and Galatia, and also the Median king sent some troops to join him. Caesar had 250 galleys of war, 80,000 foot, and horse about equal to the enemy. Antony's empire extended from Euphrates and Armenia to the Ionian Sea and the Illyrians, Khazars from Illyria to the westward ocean, and from the ocean all along the Tuscan and Sicilian Sea of Africa. Khazar had all the coast opposite to Italy, Gaul, and Spain, as far as the Pillars of Hercules, and Antony, the province from Kyrene to Ethiopia. And I guess I've commented enough that I only had 6 pages.